female Rishis and philosophers in the Veda. It is a traditional but common misconception that a considerable number of Vedic hymns were imposed by women. Though female authors and interlocutors are not entirely absent from the Vedas, the role of literate women in the Veda will have to be re-evaluated. The traditional names given for female Vedic authors include those derived from the wordings of the hymns, but also personified belief, speech and habit. It is a traditional and common misconception that a considerable number of Vedic hymns were composed by women. This amounts to some 20 female figures that have been regarded as Vedic Rishis, ever since the index to the Veda, the late Vedic Sarvanagramani, was composed, supposedly by Katyayana. The tradition regarding Veda authors has been very strong. It is a custom even today to mention the author before starting to recite a Vedic hymn. However, we have to distinguish the traditional authors of the hymns from those actually preserved in the body of the text. The two sets frequently do not overlap. I cannot go into this matter in detail. Suffice it to say that all statements in the Anagramani must be regarded with a healthy dose of suspicion. Especially as far as RV10 is concerned, clear invention of authors is easily visible. The method frequently used is to take up obvious names of some person or allusions to them found in the body of the hymn and make them the authors, even if it concerns such abstract concepts as Radha trust, belief. Though female authors and interlocutors are, prima facie at least, not entirely absent from the Vedas, the role of literate women in the Veda will have to be re-evaluated. We have to distinguish, of course, between mere interlocutors in the hymns from actual authors, though women speaking such verses have habitually been made authors of these stanzas by the Anagramani. In the sequel, we will take a closer look at the various types of alleged female Rishis, starting with obviously absurd cases, such as goddesses as authors. Among the alleged female authors of Vedic hymns, it is easiest to do away with the mythological figures, in other words, goddesses and female entities that are of mythological antiquity, such as the first humans and their immediate progeny. A number of such female Rishis clearly are goddesses. They include Aditi, Indrani, Urvasi, Yami, Yamavavasvati, Saramadevajuni, Sarparajni, Savitri. They will be discussed here, though for obvious reasons not in great detail. Indrani. Yami equals Yamavavasvati Savitri. Indrani is of course the wife of the prominent god Indra and figures in the famous, quite obscene dialogue of RV10. 86 is interlocutor of Indra, the bull monkey Vrisakapi and his wife. Surya is the daughter of the sun god Surya and the bride of god Soma. The hymn has been the pattern and model of all Hindu marriages to follow, and of the ideology underlying it, such as the three previous divine husbands of any human bride. The less said about such divine authors, the better. Yami equals Yamavavasvati, the sister of Yama, son of Vivasvant, and the first mortal though still a god. His brother Manu is the first human. Such mythical beings from the beginning of humankind are not expected to be authors of Veda hymns. The rest of the cases in this section are women of the distant mythological past that come from the very beginning of humankind. Here belongs the sister of Yama, the first mortal being, and Urvasi is the wife of Manu's son Pururvas and disqualified for the same reason as Yami. The same applies to clearly mythological animals, Saramadevajani 10.108.2, 4,6, 8,10, 11, and Sarparajni 10.189. While frogs do speak in the Veda, they do not compose hymns, and do so only in a simile. However, a fairly silent being, the daughter of the Queen of Snakes, is supposed to have composed this short hymn. The hymn is of enigmatic character, through it is not a riddle hymn, such as RV10. 164. A snake is not visible at all in this hymn. The attribution to a snake or snake deity is an idea of the Anagramani, which however also gives the alternative that the author is the goddess Surya. The bitch of Indra, Sarama, certainly is not a likely author either, though Samveda signing is sometimes compared, in the Brahmana texts, with the howling of dogs. In the well-known hymn RV10, 108, Sarama is supposed by the author of the Anachromani as the speaker of those stanzas where she appears as speaker. Disregarding all of this, Sarama has twice been represented in the international Sanskrit conferences by two Indian Indologists as the ambassador of Indra, speaking many languages with the foreign cow thieves, the Pani, who were identified, no wonder, with the Phoenicians. I have hardly ever heard more entertaining talks. They were certainly worthy of a TV sketch, but not of an Indian government travel subsidy. I think we can agree that our dogs, or even this divine one, may tell us much, but they do not compose Vedic poetry. Equally easily disposable are the female Rishis, that in fact are ritual entities and abstractions. They include Jatu Brahmajaya, Daksina Prajapatya, Vakambrani, Zradakamayani. The three entities Daksina, Vak, and Zrada are of great importance for the performance of the ritual, but they certainly are mere conceptions and abstractions. Daksina, the counter-gift, given to the priests after the performance of a sacrifice. Vak is the sacred, well-formulated speech of Vedic Rishis. It enables the composition of magically effective hymns, telling the truth and pleasing the gods. Without its recitation, ritual is impossible. Finally, Zrada, trust, belief, is an ancient Indo-European concept, confer, Latin credo, that underlies all ritual. Without the belief in its efficacy, ritual is virtually impossible and has none of the desired results. All three terms are underlying features of the all-important Vedic and later ritual, well worth of detailed investigation, but they certainly are not female humans and cannot compose hymns, even if Vak does speak all of the time. Finally, even a fervent feminist would think twice of including a ritual spoon as an authoress, such as Jatu Brahmajaya 10. 109. The hymn deals with the restitution of the wife of a Brahmin, just as King Soma once returned the wife of a Brahmin, apparently Brihaspati's wife. Gods, men, chieftains should return the wife of the Brahmin, otherwise even highest heaven would turn to disorder. A woman's voice is not heard here at all. The Anachromani had no such compunction, and made the supposed author of RV10. 109, the ritual butter spoon the wife of the then still non-existent, non-Vedic god Brahman, Jatu Brahmajaya. A ghee spoon, a word of feminine gender, is indeed mentioned in stanza 5. But that stanza just says that the gods got back their spoon. At best, this deals with a fictitious woman, derived from the wording of the stanza in question. It might have been better to have made the wife of Brihaspati the author of the hymn. She can at least speak. That leaves a number of potential real women authors of the Vedic period, Apollo Atri 8. 91, Gadha 10.134. Gosakarksavati 10. 39. 40, Brahmasa, Lepamudra, Visvabara Atri, Sachi Palome, Sasvati and Garasi. However, quite a number of these remaining women are mere interlocutors in hymns that are either dialogues or deal with other subjects. Brahmasa, the hairy one, occurs in a standard Vanastuti hymn, in which the poet Kaksivat, mentioned by name in the hymn, verse 3, thanks the otherwise unknown king Svanayabhavya for a great daksina that he received at the end of a Somasatra ritual. This included 100 pieces of gold, 100 horses, 100 cows, and in addition, all meant for his relatives, a herd of 1,060 heads of cattle, 3 chariots and 8 cows, but also, for himself, 10 chariots with young women. This is the clue of the hymn, for in verses 6-7 we find a dialogue of such a female house slave and the poet. It is phrased in a rather erotic, lascivious tone. She who is held fast, embraced firmly, squirts like a female mongoose. She who clings on, the one to be enjoyed, gives me 100 ejaculations. And the women answers, grab me here and there, don't think of me as one of little. I am completely hairy like a little sheep of the Gandharian psalm. It is again the voice of the poet who puts verse 7 into the mouth of a woman, remarkably well fit to his thinly veiled desires. Fredenastutus often are more of wishful thinking than the actual thanking a donor. The words in verse the 7th may represent or resemble the words spoken by women of the period, but this is difficult to judge as we know little about sexual slang of the period. Nevertheless, it clearly is the poet who speaks throughout the whole hymn, assuming a female voice in verse 7, and the Anakramani has reified her as an authoress, the hairy one. Lopamudra appears in the famous dialogue of Agastya and Lopamudra, and as a dialogue hymn it hardly fits the requirement of original women poetry. If so, one could also have added the even more famous dialogue of Pure Urvas and Urvasi, which suffers from the same deficiencies. Here, it is even more clearly visible that Urvasi speaks as a woman, but that her speech is seen through the eyes of a man. This is the first divorce case in India. Urvasi is good at retorting to Pure Urva's complaints, claims and desires. In short, this is a real he said, she said story, where Urvasi often twists the words of Pure Urvas in her favor. The present hymn similarly purports to be the dialogue of husband and wife, apparently that of a distant, or rather an ascetic husband and his aging, eager wife who finally manages to seduce him. It is of course ridiculous to suppose that a Vedic poet Brahman and his wife addressed each other with well-formulated verses before, or during intercourse. Verses 4. In sum, the whole hymn again is one of a male poet, who lets a woman speak in some of the stanzas. The tone is sexual throughout, and offers several interesting similes and slang expressions. Sasvati Angaresi is the supposed author of one of the longer Indra hymns of the RV, a hymn actually attributed to the several Kanva poets. There is nothing unusual in this hymn. It has the regular praise of Indra. However, the last pada of the last stanza, verses 34, in a meter different from the rest of the long hymn, is spoken by a woman, introduced in the verse as the woman Sasvati. The context is rather unclear. Verse 33 speaks of the chieftain Asanga, son of Playoga. Much later texts connect this chieftain with verse 34 and suggest that he regained his sexual functionality, thanks to the Rasim Dayatithi, the author of this hymn. Nothing of this tale is visible in the hymn. However, the intent of the appended stanza 34 is clear. His stiff has become visible again in front, that had hung down as a boneless thigh. When the woman Sasvati saw this, she said, "O noble one, you are carrying a joy-bringing enjoyer." As in the other cases, a few words of sexual banter have been put into the mouth of a woman, but she is not the composer of this stanza nor the hymn question. Gadha, literally cow sucker, a female warren reptile, is the supposed author of two verses found in a regular hymn to Indra, ascribed by the Anakramani to Mandatar, the son of Uvanisva. Why stanzas 6b and 7 should be composed by a woman is unclear. However, 6b has some assonance with August 1, 2034 Dnbaya Twig, branch of the lineage in verses 6, as well as the refrain addressing a genitri genitrix, may have been the reason that the Anakramani, disregarding the context, saw a female speaker author here. Note also that verse 6c is a refrain, first found in stanza 1, which is a typical copyright stamp of Vedic authors. This well-composed hymn by one poet would thus suddenly be interspersed by 6b. Hold on to the twig branch, like a ram with its forefoot, O bounteous one. The following verse 7 does not help either, as no female voice is audible. We do not fail in anything, O gods, we do not try to hide anything, we want to follow your counsel. Here, we hold on to the sides, to the shoulders at best, but quite unlikely so. Verse 7 could be seen as sexual innuendo, pronounced in the plural, as women are sometimes apt to do in the Veda, when they want to hide behind the group of women belonging to a joint family. This leaves, finally, a few women that might stand the greatest chance of having been Vedic authors first, Visvabhara at 3-5. 28, is the supposed author of a regular Agni hymn that invites all gods to the sacrifice. However, at best, stanza 1 can be seen to have a vague allusion to a female entity, a feminine Visvabharashi who is desired by all is mentioned. However, this refers to the ritual spoon, a grammatical feminine, and not to any real woman. This then is, again, a typical case of spinning off a name from the wording of a hymn. We have seen the divine Jau spoon, see above ad 10. 109. Otherwise the hymn would just have been a regular tree hymn. However, the idea of a female author may be relatively old, as J.B. 219 once mentions in passing that among the Atris there are even female mantra authors, unfortunately without specifying the stanza intended. Then, we have a number of women looking for husbands, as a young woman indeed should not remain unmarried. A famous case is Apala Atri 891. This hymn is supposed to have been composed by a young woman looking for a husband. However, the introductory verse clearly states that the rest of the hymn is a quotation introduced by the poet. It is thus unclear whether we have an original poem by a woman or, rather more likely, the words of a male poet put into the mouth of a young woman. The hymn has been treated at length by H.P. Schmidt. Another good candidate is Gosa Kaksavati. According to the Anakramani, Gosa was the daughter of the famous poet Kaksavant of R.V. Book 1. She is supposed to have composed the 3 hymns. However, the hymn itself calls her Rajnaduhita, the daughter of a chieftain. She is mentioned twice as speaking in these hymns, and therefore the Anakramani has made her the author, as it so often happened in this late Vedic text. In 10.40. 5-12, the unmarried young woman Gosa asks the Asvins for a husband. Again, the words of Gosa are quoted, after a longer introduction, found in verses 1-5. In verse 5a we have, Gosa, the daughter of a chief circumambulating the Asvin, and said, I ask for you, O men. The long speech of Gosa is of a rather erotic nature. However, the real poet of this hymn reappears at the end, in verses 13-14, with a praise to the Asvin. It is clear that the speech of Gosa has been inserted into this hymn by another author. An exceptional woman. Finally, we find an exceptional woman, Sachi Palome 10. 159. The Anakramani identifies Sachi as Indra's wife. However, this is post-Vedic conceit, a Homeric word, derived from Indra's frequent epithet Sasipati, Lord of Strength, and Sachi is not mentioned at all in this hymn. This hymn comes much close to what we would like to see of a female author. However, it is found only in the appendix to the RV, in Book 10. Indeed, it is of Atharvan character and it composed in the much more popular Anustubh meter, a predecessor of the sloka. Its character excludes it from the traditional, highly poetic, hieratic Vedic poetry. Rather, this hymn consists of straightforward sorcery. It is the self-praise, perhaps wishful in part, of the chief wife of a wealthy husband who has several wives and who also has a group of male followers. She has been so successful that she basks in her glory of having overcome all rivals, just like her sons and daughters have overcome their own enemies. She also has overcome, as a victor, her husband. Verses 1. That only to her mind the husband shall conform. Verses 2. That she can govern this man and his people. 31. All true words of an envious and powerful woman, not of a meek wife, as so often imagined in indolent Indian writing. This rather is the voice of the Prabhavati Gupta of Gupta descent and queen of the late 4th C. Vakataka kingdom of the northern Deccan, of Aditya of 10th C. Kashmir, or of the Rani of Jhansi. That is speaking here. Unfortunately for our purpose, this hymn is not one of good Vedic poetry, even if it tries starting Vedic fashion but mere sorcery stanzas. Conclusions. Where does all of this leave us? We can easily get rid of the hymns supposedly composed by goddesses, human ancestresses, mythical animals, and ritual abstractions or implements. Among the real Vedic women speaking in the hymns, most are occasional interlocutors in dialogue hymns or in other poems composed by male poets. Only a few women remain as candidates for authorship. However, even among these, Visvabharatri is spun off a grammatically female word occurring in the hymn, and among the two women looking for husbands. Apalatri's speech is a quotation made by the unknown, presumable male author, and Gosakoksavati 10.39.402 is presented just as speaking some stanzas, composed by the author of this hymn. In short, that leaves us with Sachi Palomi 10.159. It is, however, rather ironical that the only time a woman speaks up by herself and for herself, in all of the RV, this is a hymn of post-RV, Atharvedic character. And even here we cannot be sure that it actually was composed by a woman, and not by a man speaking with the voice of a woman. There is really no way to discern this, as we do not have reliable accounts of the authors of hymns, as long as they do not mention themselves, and in the RV the search for such self-referred female authors is negative. The real question is of course why women were excluded from traditional poetic formulation and from the ranks of traditional, bard-like Vedic poets. The answer is not be difficult to find. Poets traditionally were male bards, not female shamans of various stripes. In other words, in the patriarchal society of the Vedic tribes, the Indo-Aryans, and the preceding Indo-Iranians and Indo-Europeans, creating heroic and hieratic poetry was the male business. Wherever we look, we cannot find female authors, such as the much later Sappho in Greece. In India, we have to wait similarly long, until the Buddhist canon and the epics. This does not mean, of course, that women did not compose poems during the Vedic period, but it was not regarded important enough to be preserved. And we cannot say anything about it, except to speculate about its very existence, and to extrapolate its form from the male perception of female speech presented in the extracts given above. The result for the RV thus is entirely negative, and the other Samhitas agree. We simply do not have women's poetry until the Tharagatha of the Pali Canon and the supposed speeches of women in NBH. Of course, again composed by male bards. 32 It is however useful to take a brief look at the two other famous women in the Veda. 33 The Upanishadic Matri and the formidable Gargivakik Navi of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 2 and 3. Their role is usually overstated. As I have stressed elsewhere, it should be noted that women, just like satrias and kings, or even the son of a god, Bhrgu, are inserted into such dialogues at critical points or when a special, new proposition has to be made as to draw attention to its unusual character. Patriotic and nationalistic Indian writers at the time of the independence struggle badly wanted to see democracy and equality of men and women in the ancient texts, even or especially so in those days. However, Vedic equality of women is as elusive 34 as democracy in the so-called republics, rather oligarchies, of the Punjab and the Northeast. This, by now rather dated rewriting of history should finally be thrown at literary history. As could again be seen here, the Indians of today and their imagination of the past are different from those of 1000 BCE, and it is time to recognize this and describe the ancient period properly, instead of constantly imagining a golden past that never existed.